Welcome back to the 6th episode of the Inspired Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Corey Still. Today, I'm honored and excited to be joined by two very special people. I have known both of them for many years. I call one my auntie and one my brother. And it's just been an honor seeing their work and engaging with them. And it's truly humbling to be able to be here today to share space with them. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Charlotte Davidson and Mosiah Bluecloud. So Dr. Davidson is the Neh and 3 affiliated tribes, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. She's an independent scholar who lives in Dejope, Madison, Wisconsin. She received a BA in American Indian Studies from Haskell Indian Nations University and earned an MED and PhD, respectively, in Educational Policy Studies from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her scholarship and practice are deeply influenced by matrilineal pedagogies and focus on political questions and epistemological concerns linked to Indigenous higher education, the decolonization, and critical pedagogies. Mosiah is currently an American Indian Graduate Center Scholar and was just named one of our Graduate Students of the Month for June. He's an enrolled member of the Kickapoo Tribe of Oklahoma. Currently, he's preparing to start his PhD in linguistics. Mosiah has an extensive knowledge of native languages. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Linguistics from the University of Oklahoma and a Master's degree in Native Languages and Linguistics from the University of Arizona. He has established the Kickapoo Teacher Training Program for the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Kickapoo Language Department for the Kickapoo Tribe of Oklahoma, and previously served as lead instructor at the Sauk Language Department in Stroud, Oklahoma. So, Dr. Davidson, Mosiah, I just want to welcome you both to the show. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you, nephew.
So I know we give your official bio and things like that, but that doesn't always encompass who we are. And so to start off, I just wanted to just kind of ask you to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yate Charlotte Davidson Unishia, She Todeglini Nishlin, Waterbuster Clanny, Bushichi, Kitlichini Dashiche, Nana Flint Knife Clanny Dashinella. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Corey. I'm also a mom. I have 2 beautiful sons. One is a soon-to-be senior at Haskell Indian Nations University. And I also have an 11-year-old who will be starting 6th grade this fall. And I'm also married. My husband is Filipino and has Scottish heritage. And I really, attribute, the manner in which I think, plan, and live, to my children. I think had it not been for their own emergence within my life, I don't think I would have been able to, develop the language to understand and name the world in ways that I do now. So I really attribute them into, with endowing me, with that ability, to really more deeply understand my role and my responsibility as a woman here. So again, thank you.
I am, I'm just a nerd that loves languages. I'm trying not to be a one-trick pony here. And, but I kind of eat, sleep, drink, and pray native language. So.
And I love that. Mosiah, I've known you for many years, and that's one of the things I've always admired about you is your love for native languages. So as we kind of go through here, one of the things I want to ask, just to kind of start the conversation off, is culture and tradition, especially within Indian communities, play such an integral piece of who we are. And understanding that, in what ways can we honor and preserve these pieces of ourselves in our communities? Because we live in a time right now that we're seeing this increase in our cultures. I don't want to say diminishing, but beginning to be overpowered by other cultures or other societies. So what advice or ways could you give to people listening about how we can honor and preserve those within ourselves and our communities?
Well, for me personally, I feel that especially given our current reality, it's so easy to feel estranged from these locations that we all have an umbilical connection to. For me personally, I really long, to go home, but I can't right now. So one of the ways that I think I strive, to enact culture and tradition, no matter where I'm at, no matter the context, no matter the conditions that may prevent me from going home, that I can still return home in a way through prayer, getting up early, with the sunrise or before, and just pray in my own way with sage and cedar. And I always reflect back to what my maternal grandmother had shared with me before she had passed on. And she said, even if the only thing you have is a Tutadine Bajish, a corn pollen bag, even though that's all you have nothing else, no other, for lack of a better word, medicine or tool or modality with you, that you can use that to sustain yourself. Use that to seek balance and harmony and beauty. And I think I try, to follow that grandmother's counsel, on a daily basis. It's hard. I'm not always successful, at doing that, but I try to model that for my children, because again, we're not able to physically return home, but we still hold that ability to return in ways through our prayer, by putting out, tobacco bundles. And, you know, I just really strive to model, for my children, those ways. And, I encourage my son, who is going to be a senior at Haskell. I remember one of the first things I showed him when he started school there was I showed him the different locations that he can go, to pray, to ask for strength, to ask for guidance, to have these conversations surrounded by the natural world, and to go at a certain time and to give an offering, and that's how you're going to remain, connected to who you are. And we're all going to have our trips and falls. We're not, perfect people, but we should always strive to be the ideal relative, you know. And so, when I think about that question, those are some things that, immediately come to mind for me.
And I appreciate that. And I think that's important to understand. Even though we can't be in a physical place, we can still use those tools that we've been given. Either those medicine tools, those prayer tools that we've been given to connect.
I center everything that I do around language with the intent of passing it on to. I don't have any kids of my own, but I try to pass it on to nieces and nephews. And in community language classes, I always try and teach my students how to also teach, so that that everything that I pull from either documentation in Washington, D.C., working in the archives there, or hanging out with a monolingual Kikpu speaker or one of the Last Sock speakers, any word that I elicit and that I have, I immediately pass that on to anyone that's around, Sauk tribal member, Kikpu tribal member, anybody. Just that I don't want it to stay with just me. So I'm one of my things is I'm always trying to just trying to end a mode of thinking that used to exist, where this attitude of scarcity, like a scarcity mindset that once existed within um, the communities I work in, where it seemed like since the language was in a state of attrition, that meant that there wasn't enough to go around. But the truth is that to combat that, everything has to be shared with everyone, even between family members. Because with language is about communication and talking to other people. So um, if you're not teaching to talk with other people, then what's going on? So I'm all about fostering an attitude of abundance within the communities I work in, that there is always enough language for everybody.
I think both of those are key pieces. We talk about using the tools and we talk about using language and really ensuring that we illicitly use that language in our everyday lives. But when we work with Native students, one of the things we have to understand is Native students are having to navigate spaces that weren't never intended for them. They're having to navigate these situations and these places that never really intended Native people to be in. And so how can our communities help empower our Native students to be resilient and to thrive in these places?
Okay, so I really feel what got me through my time at OU, or even my time out here, is just all the prayers that even prayers that I've been a part of. When they talk about right now, we're going to pray for all the students that are in higher education. Like, I feel like every when there's medicine around, there's always a prayer for the students that are in higher education. And it seems like I appreciate that. It seems like praying people are very aware that we are out here in spaces that aren't for us. And I feel that sometimes, when things get hard and I get tired, a deeper tired that's just more than physical, I feel like something else lifts me up and helps me to stay up a couple more hours and finish those last couple of paragraphs on a paper. And I really like how a lot of tribes I've seen, like the Kikpu tribe and the Sauk tribe, they acknowledge and they acknowledge academic accomplishments. And I feel like it's not just good for the student that's being acknowledged, but it's also good for the upcoming youth and students to see someone else is doing it. I can do that too. And I know that's always helped me, knowing of indigenous scholars that came before me, seeing them. Like, I'm here at the University of Arizona because of Dr. Ophelia Zepeda, who's been working in Native language revitalization since the early 70s. She's done a lot, and many strong indigenous people like her, seeing them in these linguistics doesn't get more it doesn't get much more white than linguistics. But to see these Native people in here, making a space for me to come in and to sit beside them and learn from them, that's that there's that support there that's really important. And then also, I know my tribe, we have I think most tribes have an education department. I think the Sauks do too. But they always have like a unity group of high school age children that come in, and they foster, they teach how to look for scholarships and networking amongst themselves. And I feel like that can never get enough support. So I'm always, even with my language department, I'm always checking in with the education department and making sure that those youth are getting support, and anything I can do, I try and be there.
Yeah, I really appreciate Mosiah's interpretation of the question. It definitely helps me, think more deeply about how to respond to your inquiry. And when I think about communities in this question, I think about it within the context of Indigenous higher education communities, meaning those communities within various campus settings. And I think in my time as a student, as an administrator, as a faculty member, one of the things that I feel like is so critical in, developing in students is, helping them develop the capacity to hone their narrative within these spaces. And what I mean by that is, I have supported and served students and have gone to grad school with peers for a variety of reasons, but primarily due to settler colonialism, that they have not, been given the teachings needed to conceptualize their worldview or to understand their worldview. And, I draw from one of the experiences, one of the most profound experiences I had as a doctoral student at the University of Illinois, where I had my maternal grandfather, who's no longer around, Dr. Larry Emerson, and he would never say he would teach us. He would just say, "I'm just mediating the learning. You guys know, I'm just mediating learning for you." And he mediated the learning for this graduate level course on decolonizing methodologies and indigenous knowledge. And he situated his teaching of this course by saying, "I'm going to approach the class through a Diné lens. And I know because of settler colonialism and the way that it has violently penetrated our creation stories that are still ongoing, I recognize that some of you may not know what your worldview is or how to describe it or what is foundational to who you are as peoples, whether you're native or not. And so knowing this, I'm going to tell you that you can borrow my framework until you find your own. But please, please, please do not appropriate my framework. And the quest here should always be for you to look for that for yourself. And that was such a significant pedagogical experience for me. I think a lot of the people in that particular course, were challenged to really introspect, and really truly understand who we are in relation to these, Western learning contexts, and to understand more deeply that an entirely different learning context predated these institutions. These institutions are settled on top of, these places that have always served as sites of our education and our development as Indigenous peoples. So our teacher, our land, our resources, our water, are now surrounded by or suppressed by these buildings and unions and different structures, that are a natural part of a campus setting. And so, so I think what I've done as an administrator and as a faculty member is really take that teaching that I learned from my grandfather and apply it in my roles to, to support and serve Native students, to mentor other Indigenous professionals and administrators that work in higher education, because these are spaces that have a theory about us. They see us through a deficit lens, when really the deficit is theirs, because our worldviews as Indigenous people are just inherently global. We're taught to, you hear these terms, diversity and inclusion and justice. Those really, have been foundational to how we conceptualize these philosophies that are really ancient. And we've been taught to think, in seventh generational terms, to not just think about now, but for generations ahead, and it's time that these spaces catch up and they have to do their work. But in the meanwhile, I think what we can do as members of Indigenous higher education communities is really take the time to not only hone our narrative, but to teach others to do the same. I can't help but think back to my own, Danette creation narratives and how, that is ongoing now. And, that those lessons and that journey that my ancestors embarked on, that, I'm a continuation of that journey, of questing for what we term as hajo and ke, beauty, balance, harmony, kinship, relationality. And in that quest, let's not recreate harm. And so I think once we become better at understanding who we are in our stories, I think we, can increase our capacity to be, critical actors that can transform in good ways these experiences in higher education settings.
And as you're talking, I get pulled back to my master's work where I got to share space with your grandpa. And when you talk about helping students form that narrative, I remember sitting and having conversations with him when he talked about balance, and in Katua we call it UTA. And we shared that space, and he was brought in, and we had that conversation, and he mediated that. And he really was, I'm just here to facilitate. I'm not here to teach. And I remember him using those same words and praying with us and helping us find that narrative. And I think that's just a critical reflection of the work that continues, not only through your grandfather, but through you and through the next generation of those practitioners and scholars in Indigenous higher education. And I think that's something that we all sometimes need to listen to, because sometimes it's hard, I think, for students to find their own narrative, because again, we're constantly bombarded and we're constantly told, you have to walk in two worlds, or choose which world you walk in, when we have to remember, we were in this world far before these institutions of higher learning were here. And our thought processes and our ways and our prayers were here long before these buildings and these institutions were here. And we have to walk in these spaces with those.
When you were talking, it made me think about how, our grandmothers and our grandfathers and different knowledge carriers that are in our communities, there needs to be an increase of inviting those individuals into our learning experiences. And I'm not talking about just simply serving as guest lecturers or a special invited guest, but they should be serving as official members of our dissertation committees. I had the blessing, honor, and privilege of that happening for me with this same grandfather, and he really challenged my thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I remember submitting my literature review to him, nervously waiting to receive feedback from him because I knew he would have some critical thoughts to share. And sure enough, one of them was, you know, granddaughter, you use the word domain to describe traditional knowledge. Domain is a derivative of dominion. Don't use that to describe traditional knowledge. Use terms like, you know, this is a branch or a sphere of knowledge, or use a Diné term or an indigenous term. And I remember reading those comments and having that conversation and thinking, what did I get myself into? Like, wow, I'm really going to have to work and labor really, really hard in ways that I had not been academically trained to do up to that point. And he really encouraged me to dream and to pray. I have never had an instructor at that level tell me to enact those methods to improve my thinking around the development of my research and scholarship, you know, and that really set the stage for him creating this empowering university context that really didn't exist for me prior to his arrival, you know, as a faculty person on our campus.
So as we kind of move forward here, you know, in our tribal communities, more than not, we often see that there are no systems in place to receive educated people back into the communities once they've completed their degrees. How can our tribal leaders and tribal governments create infrastructure to support these individuals and offer opportunities to tie traditional teachings with education, with the education that they've received?
The thing, how I felt is after I got my bachelor's in linguistics from the University of Oklahoma, the business committee, the elders and the elder center, and then also my peers, and then my parents' age group, Kickpoos. Everybody had an open ear when I came back to the community from Norman, and honestly, I don't think nobody knew where I fit, but they gave me the space to find my place. So I told them, I have this degree in linguistics now, and we need a language department. We don't have one. And I'd like to be director of it. And I would like to produce materials because everyone feels that unless they have a speaker in their house, there are some families, their last speaker of Kickpoo was, you know, their grandparents' age or great-grandparent. And for them, they, you know, there was no written documentation really for them. There was no dictionaries or grammars or coloring books, just there was nothing. And so I told them I can, within a year, get all the documentation, all the resources into all the Kickapoo's homes, as well as we can offer community classes, and we can bring speakers, and we can bring elders into these community classes, and we can feed them, and we can feed everyone, and we can be together, and we can all just talk in the language, about language, and just have a celebration of language all the time. But it wasn't all smooth. There was definitely pushback. There were members of the community that didn't want me to do what I was doing, and they felt it was disrespectful. They felt that language should be learned in the home and from your own family members, and families that didn't have the language anymore. There was a reason why they didn't have it anymore, and it should stay that way. There was pushback against that, and I I had to fight. I had to fight against that. I had to take a stand and stick to my guns that every Kickapoo has a right to their own language and their own culture, and that I would be willing to have resources and a space for them to do that. As students come in, back into their communities, there might not be a space. Hopefully, the community, like my Kickapoo community, there were a lot of people that were willing to help me make a space. But also, even I had to fight a little bit. Students coming in should know that it just because we have our degrees and we come in doesn't mean that we're not going to have work to do to make our spaces. Because a lot of times, people simply don't know where we're going to fit in now.
So, Mosiah, how do you think tribes can do better?
I think tribes can just listen after we come back. That's probably the biggest thing. As the business committees really just listen to what we've learned and how we've changed, and be open to us creating the maybe jobs or even volunteer places, maybe like a new community activity for the youth, another place for them to go after school, or strengthening. There's always room for improvement, and especially with how tribes handle their education departments and stuff.
Absolutely. When I think about this question about what sort of infrastructure is needed, I think about I can't help but circle back to some of the things that Mosiah said, which was listening to us. As our native Hawaiian relations would say, talk story, with these students that are not only in the midst of this educational journey, but those who have completed it, because I feel that when I hear other students recount their experiences, oftentimes they're not good. A lot of students, struggle to navigate these spaces because, as you mentioned earlier, nephew, they weren't designed for us. And I don't know if, there are people in our communities who often understand that. Your question reminds me of a experience I had when I was a visiting scholar at a certain institution back east. And this young woman that I had the opportunity to talk story with was sharing with me that her family, especially her father, was so proud that she was attending this particular prestigious institution, but she didn't want to be there. It was, she said there was just so much, racism. There was a lot of different struggles that she was having to contend with, but she felt like she had to choose to suffer through those experiences just to make, her father proud. And at the same time, she told me, when I go back home for Christmas break or for the summer, I get shunned by my family, different family members. I get shunned by different community people who think that, who know I attend this certain institution, and they make these assumptions that I'm coming back thinking I'm better than they are, or that I know who they are. And so she was in this space where she was conflicted about, I don't want to stay in this space, but my father's proud of me. Our tribe is telling me to go and get my education, but they don't know how to welcome me back. I'm not welcome back. So it really creates a lot of confusion and just seems to be a kind of chaos that, students find themselves in. And so I think that, much like many of our ancestors had done in the past, before we really can create some kind of material supports or infrastructure. We need to talk story with each other. We need to pray about it together so we can come together as one to develop these solutions. Because I think that sometimes, communities might make assumptions, incorrect ones, about maybe our needs, and maybe not realizing the gifts that a lot of people end up carrying back to their communities, but it goes unrecognized. And I think a good example of how perhaps communities do recognize needs is, one of my aunts, my mother's older sister, Lena Yazi. She was talking to me about Navajo rug weaving. I asked her, what makes a good rug? Describe that for me. And she said, I think all rugs are good, no matter what the outcome is, because that person dedicates a lot of labor. You have to have a certain kind of thought process and planning process to create a rug, to be at that loom space. And she said, it's probably like what you're doing now. You're writing this dissertation, and I'm sure it's a lot of work, but you're in the process of writing, just like weaving, you're pulling together all these threads, and your loom, just like your methodology, has to be robust, to withstand the tensions that you're going to be exploring in your work. She really made me re-see, myself as a weaver, but on a different platform. So when I think about these infrastructures needed, for our students, I think that, oftentimes they're within our own homes, like a loom space, a beading space, a pottery space, are ways that are infrastructures, if you will, cultural ones, that really can help teach us, how do we take the cultural offerings of higher education, and tie them together with the cultural offerings of our communities. Let's engage in that work in a communal way. Because our knowledges as Indigenous peoples, our traditional knowledges, they don't just come to us in solitude. It's a communal effort. Like everything I'm sharing here, it's not my knowledge, it's my people's knowledge, my family's knowledge. I'm just simply carrying forward their message, just to circle back to the question of, how can our tribal leaders and tribal governments create that infrastructure, to support individuals. I think, there needs to be some storytelling, exchanged between students and those peoples in our communities.
I appreciate both of your responses to that. One of the key factors that you both kind of hit on is it does start in the home. It does start in our families and then in our smaller communities, and helping build that infrastructure up through the tribes and through the government. We've covered a lot of different areas today, but is there any other pieces of advice or strategies for anyone that might be listening that you could give to them to incorporate traditional teachings into their everyday life, whether that be their school life, whether that be their work life, whether that be their home life, or any combination of those?
My advice for any students that are listening would be to be aware of the seasons. If you don't know how what your tribe is traditionally up to in the seasons, maybe look into that, because even out here in Arizona, I try and be aware of how I conduct myself as a Kickapoo in the winter, in the spring, and in the summer. And even if I'm away from ceremony, I try and be there in spirit. And always remember your spirit. Take care of your spirit. remember that the people you're around, or not around, or movies and music, they all affect our spirit. And we have to remember that as Indigenous people, that we got to take care of our spirit so our spirit can take care of us. Check in with elders often, and always encourage the youth. This one's tough for me. It's the biggest thing I'm working on right now. Is I'm trying to always try to move towards a more traditional diet. Not like food, not like fry bread traditional, but like corn soup. But yeah, that would be my advice. That's I wish what I just said, I wish somebody had told me when I was like 16, 17.
Well, for me, in terms of advice and strategies, one of the things that I return to again comes from my grandfather. After he encouraged me to dream my dissertation and to pray about it, I created a Dene learning modality, which is, the corn pollen bag. That's a method of, I think our survival and our persistence in these spaces. Because when we dream about something, it really affirms for us the path that we have to clear for ourselves. And, I mentioned praying earlier about praying with cedar and sage and so on and so forth. I would also encourage students, for example, to think about, if you're writing a paper, a dissertation, a thesis, you're working on a project, how is that reflected in the ways that you pray? For example, for me, as a person who not only created a corn pollen bag, but carries one, I've been challenged to embody my thinking, my planning, the way that I live after the corn pollen bag. So it's required me to really think more deeply about the language that I use to describe, myself and my experiences. It's challenged me to, adopt a language that's all about, restoration and beauty and harmony. And it's taught me, that I should position myself as a relative to all. And these aren't necessarily teachings that we're taught again, as graduate students, as administrators. They're not a part of our socialization processes. But it's still possible to restore those understandings. We all have the ability to do it. We just have to make the time and the commitment, to bring those teachings forward for us, because they're there. They're there waiting for us, to engage them. When I think about, just the various ways that we can bring these beings into emergence, I think about, why not take up pottery making or beading or weaving. Your first rug, for example, on a Navajo loom may not be perfect, but it's an educational space that is always there waiting for you. Unlike these higher education settings, particularly the non-native colleges and universities that are so often fraught with conditions of oppression and racism and exclusion and marginalization, the loom space, you're not going to experience that ever. It's a space where you can feel whole and good about yourself. That's a teacher that's always ready for you to sit at its base and engage it. And, that's where I think some of the most beautiful, strategies, can emerge, where, let's not just maybe read about weaving or pottery making or so on and so forth. Let's really get in and commit ourselves to doing that labor, because it has a propensity to be so liberatory and transformative, and it'll help us re-see, the things that we need to do to, to survive and navigate these spaces, not only for ourselves, but to create conditions where the people behind us who come up behind us, our kids, grandkids, and so on and so forth, don't have to suffer. Let's lessen the suffering for the people coming behind us. And let's always remember that we have a responsibility to clear a path for those people.
I just want to thank both of you again for being here to share space and talk story, as Auntie said, with us today. To all of our listeners out there, I just want to say thank you all for once again being with us as we journey together through this inspired podcast. And hopefully, as we've gone through, you've learned a few nuggets of wisdom that will help you be resilient in your spaces. So until next time, this is your host, Dr. Corey Still. Woodall.